Caregivers, have you ever felt like nothing? I mean, nothing is going right? Well, cheer up and welcome to Dave the Caregiver's Caregiver radio program, where you'll learn how to avoid that dreaded thing called caregiver burnout and how to survive the grief process. You know, with roughly 100 million caregivers in the U.S. and Canada alone, that's about a third of the population. That means that everyone probably knows someone caring for a loved one. Join Dave and his guests now and every Wednesday at noon Pacific Time as they discuss avoiding caregiver burnout and surviving grief. So find a comfortable place to relax, kick up your feet, and prepare to feel better and to receive practical tips and tools that you can start using immediately to get you through today and every day so you can survive your tomorrows. But not just survive, but to live life fully and abundantly. Yes, you heard me right. That is a possible goal to achieve. And now, here's your host, Dave Nasani. From Los Angeles, actually from Waikiki Beach in Hawaii, a big welcome to all my listeners out there in Radio Land. I'm Dave, the Caregiver's Caregiver, coming to you live from the worldwide Blog Talk Radio Network, as well as iTunes and YouTube and Stitcher Radio and 7 other platforms that are just too numerous to mention. Our goal here is to do our very best to help you avoid that dreaded thing called caregiver burnout. And we have an exciting show planned for you today with my lovely co-host who is not here. Poor Adrienne is recovering from knee surgery, so she's just not up to par yet. But that's okay. It'll be lonely without her, but I can do it. So today we'll be interviewing author and caregiver Sandra Savell of Dear Clueless, A Daughter's Journey Through Alzheimer's Caregiving. It's a story of a decade of caregiving as her mother progressed from forgetfulness to not knowing who she was, and eventually to her passing from complications of Alzheimer's disease. So stay tuned. You do not want to miss this show. I'm your host, Dave Nasani, and this show is caregivers of every single kind. The one thing we know about caregivers is that they are caring, selfless, sacrificial, but they also have this tiny little problem called burnout. They tend to put everyone else's needs above their own, you see. And they're kind of wired that way. They can't help themselves, but they have to help themselves or else they will die, because 30% of them will actually die before their loved ones do, unless they can change some habits. So let's learn something from the airlines. Tell us in the event of an emergency, put your oxygen mask on first before you attempt to help your loved ones with their mask. What an amazing metaphor for all of life. Take care of you first. Not out of selfishness, but out of survival. Now, we also talk about grief and loss here and the devastating effect that it can have on us. Anytime anyone suffers a loss, they go through something called the grief process. It could take days, it could take weeks, it could take months or years. It could take forever. Everyone is different. But if you feel like you're kind of stuck through your grief and you want to get through it, well, I think we can help you. So I do want to take this time and thank my last week's guest, Dr. Jan Mesnink, a family practice physician with tens of thousands of hours of experience in the emergency medicine and neurosurgery in Southern California and Central California. And just a reminder, you can listen to that interview and all of our interviews, including this one, right on our website, caregiverscaregiver.com. That's caregivers with an S, caregiver without an S.com. And I'm so excited about the sales of my new best-selling book. It's My Life Too, Reclaim Your Caregiver Sanity by Learning When to Say Yes and When to Say No. Continue to soar. Charlene and I are still on our national media tour, and in fact, we're here in Hawaii. Just got booked today on NBC CBS Hawaii Morning Show, and we're having a couple of book signings, and we're still pitching the other networks, so hopefully that'll all happen. And our goal, of course, in about 3 months is to be on national shows like Dr. Oz and Good Morning America, the Today Show. So far, I've appeared on 16 morning shows all across the country since October 6th, and I'm booked on 8 more, including an internationally syndicated morning show, The Flash. So now that makes me an international caregiving awareness advocate, which I'm humbled by all of that. But enough of all that. A big welcome to my guest, Sandra Savell. Sandy, how are you? And why don't you take a couple of minutes and just explain who is Sandra Savell and why was she put on this earth?
Well, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I've often wondered why I was put here on this earth. I really don't know, and I probably won't know until I meet my maker face to face. But as a child, I was always the one who ran and got the band-aids for somebody. I was always the one who worried about somebody else in class crying. Um, my mother, my mother was a single mom, and she never learned to drive a car, and so I just automatically stayed home until I got married the first time at age
Mm.
26. Um, but I was also born into a Hungarian home, and there's always one child that either doesn't marry or they stay home until they do marry, which is exactly what I did. Um, I had a sister who had learning disabilities and actually died of alcoholism right after my mother did. I lost my mother and my sister
Oh,
within 9 months of each other.
oh my.
And right now I'm a caregiver to a husband with a neurological problem, and he is now home on disability, and we've been dealing with this problem with no diagnosis yet for 16 or 17 months. My name, I once looked up the meaning of the name Sandra, and it means defender of mankind. And when you're a caregiver, you defend the person you're caring for, often against a medical system that isn't working properly. And also, you're defending them often against themselves, especially people with Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
So maybe that's one of the reasons I was put on this earth. And
Well,
I was also writing at a very young age little pretend novels when I was
really,
10, 11 years old.
maybe we should publish those too.
I don't, nah.
Children's book. So you're just wired as a caregiver. You were kind of made that way. And thank God
Yes.
that God wires certain people for caregiving. And I'm not naturally wired that way. I had to learn to be a caregiver. I'm not the servant kind. It doesn't come natural. And the bad thing about those kinds of people is they expect other people to be just like them and to feel the intensity of helping. And you're just going to set yourself up for disappointment because you are
Yeah.
like 10% of the population, and the other 90%, really don't get you guys. And the best they can do is understand and try to be like you. But it will always be an effort. It won't come naturally. So God bless you. I think we should just get right into it and talk about your book. Why don't you explain why you wrote your book and what it's all about?
Okay. Well, when when I met my husband, I lived in Washington D.C. and we moved to Northern Virginia. I'm a Yankee by birth. I grew up in Florida, but I consider Florida a suburb of New York and New Jersey.
Hmm.
So we ended up moving here to Aiken, South Carolina, which is basically the deep South. So within 6, 7 months of moving here, my mother moved in with us with Alzheimer's. And I had no idea what I was getting into. In other words, I was clueless. And as I spoke to people, everybody had great ideas about what I needed to do with my mother. Now, let me just give you a little background of my mother, okay? My
Okay.
mother cursed. She cursed like a sailor, drank like a battalion of Marines. Honestly, Canadian mist and water was her breakfast, but I never saw her drunk. She never met a stranger. She never lost a friend. And she never made more than minimum wage her whole life, but she helped people financially if she could,
Oh.
every way she could. She was a bartender. And so she comes and she moves here, and I am totally over my head with this whole situation. So as I'm asking for advice, people are giving me advice based upon deep Southern roots. I had a dear lady say to me, "Well, you just need to plant a rose garden with your mama, because then you can get out in the sun and she can do something creative, and that would probably calm her down." So one day I said to my mother, "Mom, you want to plant a rose garden?" And she goes, "No." Uh, she
Yeah, so
she
much for the advice.
she was, she was just not of this mentality, and there's nothing wrong with it. But I realized, number one, that you can read all the books you want about Alzheimer's, but you have to realize that the way the person is going to react to their surroundings as
Uh-huh.
they dive into dementia is going to be based on their memories, their practices, and how they were raised. And she was not raised in this atmosphere. So I had to do a lot of changing and a lot of thinking. But I would come to my husband and I'd be crying over somebody said this, or I'm so frustrated and I don't know what to do. And he would say to me, honey, they're just clueless. They're just clueless. And my mother, being a bartender, had developed what I called, and she excelled at it, pitter patter cocktail party conversation. My mother could converse with everybody and anybody, but she never said anything. It was, hi, how are you? Nice day. Love your outfit, that type of stuff. And I would take her to doctors and they would tell me, I don't think she has Alzheimer's. And we would leave their office and she would get in the car with me and scream and cry about a dog that had been dead for 75 years that she couldn't find. So,
Oh,
people, even the medical profession can be clueless about this. So my husband kept saying, you need to write a book, you need to write a book. And one day when I started putting my notes in order, I thought, what am I going to name this? What
shut
am I going
that.
to call this book? And I just thought, they're clueless.
So you gave credit to your husband for the title of the book. That's good.
Well, he deserves a lot of credit because not too many husbands move their mother-in-law into their house.
And it sounds like the doctors are clueless as to what's wrong with him.
Yes, they are right now. Yes, they are right now. He's, as one doctor has told him, you're a tough nut to crack diagnosis-wise. But we do
Wow.
know he doesn't have ALS, he doesn't have MS or MD. So we're like, okay, that fear has been taken away from us.
Yeah, well,
We
that's
just need
good.
to find out what it is.
So, how did you feel about taking on the responsibility of caring for your mother?
I
I mean,
resented
that's
it.
yeah, that wasn't expected, right? It wasn't on your resume. You weren't prepared for it.
I wasn't prepared for it, but I feared that it would happen one day. Her mother died of Alzheimer's. My father died of Alzheimer's. My mother's sister died of Alzheimer's, and also a cousin.
Wow.
So, yeah, so I was pretty much afraid that it was going to happen. But since I had basically, in my own way, taken care of my mother most of my life for many, different reasons, her being a single mom, not driving, etc., um, I didn't I didn't launch until my late 20s. And when I moved away from home, it was a lot of guilt trips from her. And so here she is coming back. I've been away from home only 25 years of my life, and now she's moving back in, or she's moving in with me.
Yeah,
And
always fun to have your mother move in with you when you're an adult, huh?
when you're a female, I mean, let's face it. And you and I spoke last night, and you said mothers and daughters always have issues.
That's right.
And yes, and it was very apparent.
Yeah.
So, and I also knew at the time that I was going to have no help from family, and that's exactly what happened.
Well,
So there was,
that was a wise assumption because you're exactly right. How did
yeah.
it affect your marriage?
Well, when my husband was 8 years old, his mother developed Lou Gehrig's disease, and he
Wow.
watched, and she lived for 5 years. And most people don't live 5 years with Lou Gehrig. She was very young, and she was very strong when she got it. But he watched his father take care of her,
Mhm.
and the whole family pitched in. So this was kind of inbred in him. He knew that he had a role to play and that it was very important, and he stood up for the task. But my husband is military, and he is a very caring person. And my mother adored him. She knew he was her son-in-law, but she never knew his name, and she wasn't sure which son-in-law he was.
Really?
So but no, it's amazing. Many people say your husband actually let her move in, and I said he actually encouraged it.
Oh my.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. Many marriages are really strained when a caregiver relationship starts coming together, depending on the condition of the parent, of course. But dementia and Alzheimer's are the worst. So you're very blessed that it didn't affect your marriage in such a way that, well, you're still married. So that's good news. So,
Actually, my mother wasn't his problem. I was more his problem. I was
oh,
so poorly dealing with it that I was just miserable to be around for a while. And he finally had to sit
oh,
down. He had to
I,
turn to me one day, and he said, I'm fine with Helen, but I'm not so fine with you, and you need to deal with this better.
wow. So you learned a lot through that. Now
Yes.
you had kids too?
No, I never had children. I married my
Okay.
husband when I was 41, and I was blessed with three grown stepsons, and now they're married, and I am a grandmother, and it's worked out beautifully.
Well, that's good. And as far as your career goes, what were you doing at the time that you became a caregiver?
I was working as an administrator for a primary care practice here in Aiken, very, very busy practice. And I was basically on track to become the office manager, but I could not work full time. So that killed that. I was working part time. But it just became as her Alzheimer's became worse, I was exhausted with dealing with her because I would come home from work and let the caregiver go. We had a part-time caregiver in the house, but my mother was getting up at 1 in the morning to make breakfast and get ready for work, or at 10
Yeah,
o'clock at night. Yeah, 10 o'clock
my
at
mother
night
did
she'd
that
put.
too. She just couldn't get down the AM PM thing. I get calls in the middle of the night. She goes, "When it's dark outside, does that mean that we go outside and do things, or do we go to sleep? I can't remember." I says, "No, Mom, it means you go to sleep." So
Yeah,
those were
yeah,
starting to be clues that she should not be alone.
yes,
So, and now we're
yes.
going through the same thing with my mother-in-law. Such
Oh,
a deadly, when my wife had the stroke and she lost her speech, I used to think that that was the worst thing that could happen to somebody, to not be able to speak, because our speech separates us from the animals. But since then, I've changed my mind. I now believe that the worst thing I think that can happen to you is for you to not know who you are or your loved ones around you. And if it gets worse and worse, you don't even know how to swallow anymore. So you can't feed yourself. You can't even you need a tube to eat, and it's just tragic, tragic.
it is. It is. And we saw much of that. One of my aunt that died of it had a feeding tube. And that was
Really.
before my mother was losing her memories. And we did all the paperwork, and she would never have a feeding tube. We decided
Wow.
on that very early. And we didn't have to.
Well, listen, let's take a break, and we'll be right back. And don't go away. We're talking with Sandra Savell. Dave Nassani, the caregiver's caregiver, has just released his sixth book entitled It's My Life Too. Reclaim your caregiver sanity by learning when to say yes and when to say no. It was specifically written for caregivers who know they should be putting their needs first, but just don't know how. Dave is the sole caregiver to his wife, Charlene, since 1996. He knows firsthand what caregivers are going through because he is one. And he now speaks all across the country, offering caregivers his incredible caregiver support package. Even the airlines tell us that in the event of an emergency, to put your oxygen mask on first before you help your child with their mask. They know that those who don't heed their advice often black out, thus becoming unable to help either themselves or their child. And caregivers are exactly the same way. It's My Life Too. Reclaim your caregiver sanity by learning when to say yes and when to say no. Will help caregivers who are neglecting their sleep, diet, and social life, and learn to put their needs first. Pick up your copy today or buy one for your special caregiver. On sale everywhere and at caregiverscaregiver.com. And we're back with Sandra Savell, author, caregiver. So I wanted to ask you, we talked about all the negative stuff. How does a caregiver stay up and positive and funny and crack jokes in the midst of stuff that goes on that is so intense and so negative? What have you found is some good advice to help people who are struggling with trying to stay positive and trying to, just look for the funny things in tragedy.
Well, first of all, you need a support group. I am very much a people person, and if you are a person that doesn't like people, you're going to suffer. You need to have people around you. I had a
No
fabulous,
introverts allowed. Yeah.
yeah, I have a fabulous church, and
Cool.
at one point, when I had to make some very difficult decisions, there was somebody who had a very judgmental confrontation with me over what I had done.
You're
And
kidding,
my,
right there in church, huh?
well, no, in a hallway, but but I was in tears,
In the
and
hallway of a church. Okay.
yeah, and my pastor saw it, and I told him what had happened, and he was so sweet. He said, the next person that says anything to you like that, I want you to call me up on the phone, and your redneck pastor will pay them a personal visit. And I think word
Oh,
got around. And
that's a good.
well, his mother had had a stroke 10 days before she died, and she wasn't demented until that time. And he said he was dealing with her for about 5 days, and he walked out into the parking lot, dropped to his knees, and said, "God, take her or take me, but take one of us."
Yeah.
And
That's a good
also,
prayer.
and also, I have a group of ladies that I cross stitch with. I'm terrible at it. It's my Zen thing that I do. And we meet regularly. And, our rule is we're here to talk and laugh. And you have to put one stitch into your project, and that's all you have to do. And they were very supportive.
Did you say cross
So
stitch? Is
cross
that like
stitch.
is that like knitting?
Um, it's in that genre.
So it
It's
gives
in
you
that
guys
genre.
something to do and talk. Talk amongst
That's it.
yourselves.
A reason to get away. But I'm very lucky. I have very good friends, and I have friends who have walked this path before I did.
So you're always
That
looking for things to, be up about and turn into a joke. So a lot of people would get upset when I would make a joke about Charlene in public settings. Uh, she'd do something that maybe would have been embarrassing, or people wouldn't know how to respond to it because she can't talk. She's nonverbal, and so I'll just make a joke of it, and I'll laugh. And some people like took that the wrong way, and it's like, oh my gosh, you're making fun of your wife, and it says, no, no, we're just trying to laugh so that we don't cry.
you got to
Any
like.
suggestions?
Well, I had some funny things happen with mom, and first of all, my husband finally, after about a second year of caregiving, he sent me away on a girls' weekend. He said, you need to get out. And so I went away, and he turned into my mother's date. I mean, he took her everywhere. He took her out to eat, he took her to church, he took her to yard sales. So I come home like 4 days later, and I'm, buzzing around, unpacking and everything. And she's standing there with her arms crossed, looking at me like, who are you and what are you doing here? And then my husband, Dale, comes into the room and he gives me this great big movie star kiss, and he leaves. And oh my God, the look on her face, I knew I was in trouble. She came rushing up and she stuck her finger in my face and she goes, let me tell you something. You're going to be leaving this house before me. You're not getting me kicked out of here. And all I could
Wow.
do was laugh. I just thought it was a fun, and well, it was very typical her, but it was very, very funny. And I'm surprised how many people don't get the humor of that. And maybe I've got a sixth sense of humor. And then there was one situation where I came home from work one day, and when you work in a doctor's office, even if you have no medical training, you get to know so much you become dangerous. So I come home and she didn't look right. She looked a little, I don't know, the color didn't look right. And I thought, I better keep an eye on that. So the next day I come home from work and she's jaundiced. She is yellow. And I'm thinking, oh my God, it's the liver. And I call the doctors and we set up all this lab work for the next day and a CAT scan and an ultrasound and all this stuff. And then all of a sudden I look at her and I think, well, her eyes aren't yellow, and her eye whites would be yellow if she was jaundiced. But mom never let me like roam around in her bedroom or bathroom. She was very private. So the minute she goes to sleep, I go into her bathroom and I'm rifling and I find a tube of self tanner. And so I call her caregiver and she said, "Well, I didn't want to tell you this. I've been trying to deal with it, but she has taken to shoplifting when we go to Walmart or Walgreens or anything like that. And I have to watch her." And obviously, this got under the radar. So the next day, I used to bring her coffee every morning before I went to work. And I said, "Hey, Mom, I saw this tube in your bathroom." And she goes, "Oh, that's my new moisturizer. I love it." She says, "I put that on about 3 or 4 times a day."
Oh my
And
gosh.
actually, she stopped. She eventually, and we'll talk about that later. She eventually went into a memory care unit, and she was shoplifting there. She wasn't shoplifting from other patients, but if she saw something she liked on an end table or maybe a Christmas decoration or something like that, yeah, it made it into her room.
So, I mean, I got to ask this, but what was a situation that was so bad that you just didn't think you were going to recover from it, that it almost took you over the edge?
She forgot me in 10 minutes one night. Um, she used to quite often eat her meals in her room because at night Walker Texas Ranger was on and she was madly in love with him. So
Mm.
I went into her room and I said, "Do you want dinner here in your room or do you want to come out and eat with us?" She goes, "No, I'll have it in here." So I brought her a tray. And just as my husband and I sat down to eat dinner, I heard that tray hit the wall and she came out screaming and crying and sobbing that Sandy had not come home from school. I had just been in there. She knew who I was just minutes before. And I kept saying, "Mom, I'm Sandy. I don't mean you, I mean little Sandy." And it took me a while, a few days to really realize what was happening, but she had gone back in her mind to when I was 12 years old. And that's how I stayed in her mind until the day she died.
Wow.
And and she was, I hated to see her anxiety. I could deal with her anger pretty well. And some of and her roaming around, that kind of stuff. But I hated to see her anxious. And she was the type of person who became anxious very easily. And once she thought something happened to me, she stayed anxious. And it just broke my heart. And it was very hard to deal with her then.
Yeah. There's a
Yeah.
couple of stressful times in a dementia patient. The pre-dementia is when to take the car keys away and
Yeah.
when to put them in a facility. Did you have to deal with, I know you dealt with the latter. How about the former?
She never learned to drive, so I never had to worry about
Thank
that.
God.
Oh,
So
yes.
what happened? What the events leading up to you deciding to put her in the facility?
Well, it was 6 months after she forgot me, and the situation of little Sandy was growing more consistent, and it was growing worse and worse and worse by the day. And I worked Monday through Friday, but on Saturday, I would take her out for coffee and donuts, and then take her to get her hair done, and maybe hit a couple yard sales. So we were coming home from the beauty shop, and she had been getting more agitated by the minute. And she looked at me and she said, "You left Sandy at the carnival and we have to go find her." And I said, "Oh, well, we're going there right now." And then she said, "You gave her to the gypsies and I need to go find my daughter." And with that, now I'm driving. She opens the car door. And thank God she had a seatbelt on, because if she didn't, she would have died then and there, and it would have been a horrible tragedy. So I'm driving down the road, and there's traffic, coming this way, and I'm trying to hang on to her, and I'm trying to keep my hand on the seatbelt so she can't get out. And this is when I realized that she was now a danger to me, herself, and other people. And this was an uncontrollable situation. So I let my husband know that we had to go to the hospital, and we took her to the hospital. And 3 days later, now this was something I didn't know. I had expected to either have to put her in memory care or a nursing home eventually, but none of these places will take an agitated and out of control patient.
Mm.
I had to put her in a mental facility for a week. And to me, that broke my heart. I knew she would die one day. I knew she would probably be in a nursing home one day, but I never I never even imagined that I would have to commit my mother to a mental health facility.
Wow.
And I had to. She was there 8 days before we transferred her to a memory care unit.
So how long did it take you to get over the grief of having to put her in there?
It didn't take long because she thrived. I mean, when she
Oh.
saw me, she would get very angry. But as I said, my mother had been a bartender. So now she's surrounded by people all day long, and she could tell her stories. And the help loved her. They thought she was a hoot, and of course she was. Um, she didn't
So,
understand why she was in with all these old people. She
yeah.
always had a boy. She always had a boyfriend. So it was And the funny thing was, she would act like it would. I would come in. I always came in during mealtime because she wouldn't yell at me in public. If I had to go into her room, I was in trouble. So I would always come in and kind of peek around the corner and see what she was doing. And she'd be holding court, she'd be talking to people, and she would be eating. And then she'd see me, and she would get very downcast. And she would start pushing her food on her plate. And she would go, "Look at this. Look at this. This is what we eat all the time." And I go, "You've got salmon, Caesar salad, rice pilaf, and Boston cream pie. Where do I sign up?" Um, but and they were it was a very nice memory care unit. So she would be at IHOP on Monday, and Tuesday they would go up for ice cream, and Wednesday they would go joyriding. So
Well,
actually, in many ways, I think she had a better life there than with me,
oh,
because
I'm sure she did.
yeah, I couldn't entertain her all the time.
So
um
how long did she go kicking and screaming? I mean, the conversation after you got home, when she tried to get out, what was that conversation like? And what
she
was her reaction? Did you tell her where she's going, or how did you
No.
pull that off?
Well, we kept her. The hospital, there wasn't a bed going to be open for 2 days, so the hospital gave us drugs to keep her very well tranquilized.
So
And
you
since
drugged her, basically.
oh yeah, she was stoned for 2 days. And the way we got her to go to this facility, and my husband hasn't gotten over this guilt, because she wouldn't go anywhere with me. I was the enemy. So he told her, "I'm taking you to a doctor's appointment." She had had a minor surgical procedure a few weeks before, and he said the doctor just wants to check on you. Well, she jumped in the car with him, and he drove her to that facility, and they took her in a wheelchair, and he came home. And I mean, he felt terrible. Well, they called about midnight and said, I could hear her in the background, and they said, "You've got to do something." And I said, "Excuse me, if I could do something, she'd be home with me. She is in a mental health facility because I can't do anything. This is your job, and don't call me again."
Wow.
And I was furious that the medical professionals were saying, "Yeah, you got to do something about this." And they finally did. They finally did. But I do have to tell you a funny story about that. Is the next morning, over the intercom, there was a announcement that Alcoholics Anonymous was going to be meeting in such and such a room at 11 o'clock. And she gets her purse and start heading for the door. And they said, "Mrs. Holden, where are you going?" And she goes, "Oh, I need to go to that meeting." Well, like I said, as a bartender, she lived pretty much a party life. And when I called my sister and told her what she did, we were laughing hysterically and said, "After all these years, she's finally getting a clue about this."
Wow.
But
Well, listen, let's take another break, and then we'll come back. We'll talk
okay,
about your book.
okay,
So don't go away.
I won't.
Anytime we suffer loss, we grieve. And a lot of people don't realize what even the grief process is. But it could be 5 to 7 steps ranging from denial, "I don't believe this is happening," anger, "Oh my gosh, I'm so upset this is happening," to a form of bargaining, "How can I get out of this?" to depression, which is a very serious thing because that often leads to suicide. And then finally, after you realize you have no more control over your situation and you're totally okay with the new normal that it brings, that wonderful, wonderful place called acceptance.
Being a caregiver takes a special person with passion and compassion. But even you can become a little burned out from time to time. The Caregiver's Caregiver radio show was developed to help you overcome obstacles, adversity, and burnout, as well as just having a place to rest, relax, and recharge your batteries. We've all been there, and you're not alone. Now, you can take the Caregiver's Caregiver with you. Get the top 25 radio shows in convenient form that plugs right into your USB car stereo or computer. Learn the techniques, tips, and encouragement we all need to better handle the day-to-day challenges. For around $1 per show, just $29.77, get the credit card-sized USB card to have with you anytime you need a caregiver's pick-me-up. Just go to DaveTheCaregiversCaregiver.com and order yours today. Go to DaveTheCaregiversCaregiver.com now. Consider it an investment in you, and ultimately, an investment in them.
And we're back with Sandra Savell, author, caregiver, and we're going to talk about her book. So, Clueless, right?
Dear Clueless.
Oh, Dear Clueless.
Yes.
Okay.
I was being polite when I wrote it.
Go ahead. Tell us. Why'd you write it? What's it about?
Well, it's actually the story of my mother, but one of the reasons I decided to write the book is when Mom was coming to move in with me, I went to the library and I took every caregiving dementia book off the shelves, and I found them to be depressing, too technical, too medical. There was one book I was reading that I was crying because it basically was telling me you can say goodbye to your marriage. And my husband walked in and grabbed the book and threw it in the back of my car and said, take it back to the library and I never want to see it again. So I wanted to do something different. I wanted a book that had the funny stories, the stories of love, very practical caregiving tips. And it's very it's very tongue-in-cheek. And probably, as you can tell by the way I talk, that, I didn't cut any corners and I'm not too worried about what people think. But I wanted people to enjoy it. It's a quick read. It's 134 pages. But I started keeping notes, and about 4 or 5 months after my mother died, I put everything down on the computer. I gave it to my husband. I said, read this. And he said, this sounds like the manifesto of a crazy person. And he says, I think you need to give it a little bit of time. And I waited really, what I didn't know is I was very sick at the time. I developed, during my caregiving years, I developed Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And then after I had surgeries for them and was starting to get better, I developed a very contained stage 1 lymphoma. And I had to have surgery for that and radiation.
My. So you're just like the 30% who gets sicker than the ones you're caring for.
Exactly.
Became a statistic.
I became a statistic. But when I sat down to write the book, I decided to self-publish because I wanted to control the situation. I didn't want a publisher telling me, take this out and add this in.
Really?
And I signed the contract, and I gave myself 4 months to finish the book, and I did. And
you signed a contract with yourself, you mean?
Well, no, I did have to go to a publishing house. I hired for self-publishing. At that time, I didn't know how to get them printed or anything like that.
So they kind of suggested you get it done in 4 months, and that was your deadline.
That was it.
So was it harder than you thought to write a book? Or you've been writing since you were a kid, right?
I find actually I'm trying to write a fiction novel now, and I'm finding that horribly hard because I have to come up with everything, whereas I was just writing from experience.
I know when you write fiction, you need to have a very good imagination and a creative imagination, know. And I'm much better also writing just nonfiction because it's right there, Stranger than truth, right? Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.
Yes, and if you're working with an Alzheimer's patient, it's always stranger than fiction. But
that's for sure.
Well, what I did is I wrote a minimum. I had a schedule. I wrote a minimum of 500 words a day. Often went way above that. I wrote five
Good
days
for
a week,
you.
and on Saturday I edited, and on Sunday I took a break, and that's how I
Good.
got it done. Yep.
And when's the next book coming out? What's it about?
Well, I have very interesting family history. On my mother's side, I am second generation off the boat from Hungary.
Really?
They escaped terrible poverty,
You were on
and
the boat with Zsa and Ava Gabor, right?
no, they were probably in steerage, and they did very well and had five daughters and a son.
Wow.
And I've discovered some history that my family, I grew up in a Catholic home, may have escaped Hungary and Czechoslovakia. They were Jewish, possibly, posing as Catholics to escape the pogroms.
Mm.
So I'm starting to do that. Now, on the other side, I really had an interesting grandmother. She pioneered the Okeechobee area of Florida, and she came down by covered wagon, and she had a shotgun over the door in the kitchen. And I would sit at her kitchen table playing with my dolls. And if somebody she didn't know walked onto her property, she would, take that fried chicken off the fire, and she would grab that shotgun, and she would kick open the door and lock and load it. And who are you, and why are you on my property? And I thought,
Wow.
I've got to write a book around this woman because she was pretty amazing and scary.
Wow.
And my
Like
husband,
Calamity Jane.
a little scarier than that. My husband used to think I was embellishing stories about her. And then he found a second cousin of mine who we visited going through town one day. And he said, oh, no, she's not embellishing at all. He said before Lula could afford a gun, she kept a big Bowie knife strapped to her thigh. And that's what she did. So
How big was the knife?
um, I don't know, but he said when she pulled it out, people got scared. And
It's
she,
like
from what I
that.
understand,
It's like that scene in Crocodile Dundee. He's getting mugged by some guy with a little knife. He goes, "That's not a knife. No, that's a knife."
and I have a funny feeling that that was pretty much the way she did things. So I'm
When you were
actually just
describing her before, I'm sorry to interrupt. When you were describing her before, you reminded me of that Johnny Cash song of a boy named Sue. She kicked like a mule and she bit like a crocodile.
she was very, very amazing, and she loved me. I tell you what, I was her little baby.
Thank
But
God.
yeah.
So tell us, let's talk about grief. A lot of the people watching here are going through the grief process. Some people say there's 5 stages, some people say there's 7. What do you say?
I think there are 5 to 7 stages, but I don't think I didn't hit them in any particular order. And I'll give you an example. When my mother passed away, I was with her, and there was this bit of relief. She had broken her hip, and I had stayed at
Yeah,
the hospital with her for 9 days, not 24
yeah.
hours a day, but I was there every day. I was exhausted, and and she was suffering at this point, physically as well as mentally. So there was that relief that she was released. Um, there were a lot of anger issues that came up with me, not against her, but against certain things that happened within the family. Um, I did all of her paperwork. I was the executor of her estate. There was no problems with that. But she has been gone now since 2010, and I do a lot of speaking. And quite often, as I'm talking about her and I'm in front of a crowd of people, I will get teary-eyed. I will start to cry. And actually, I was at my chiropractor's office about a year ago, and another patient came in and said he had just done an Alzheimer's ride of 200 miles, and he needed an adjustment. And before I knew it, I was sobbing. So that's almost 8 years, 7 years, and the grief still pops up.
Where do you
And
speak and what do you speak on?
I just speak about my book. I speak about caregiving. I tell the funny stories of my mother, but I talk a lot about things we have to do to be proactive about our health because they
Mm.
are finding more and more that people who don't exercise, people that don't eat well, people that, don't take care of themselves are more prone, if not to just to get Alzheimer's, but get it earlier. So I'm very proactive about that. And I talk a lot about political activism and getting involved because, as whether you know it or not, it is the least funded disease. It is a disease that has no real prevention. It has no real treatment. You have your Aricept and your Namenda, and that's like putting a baby aspirin to cancer. And of course, it has no cure. And it is the least funded disease out there. And there are diseases that they have found prevention, cure, and treatment for that are getting all the money. So
All right. So what about the stages now? Tell us about the stages of grief.
as you said before, there's denial, there's bargaining. I don't think I did any bargaining. I did have, and I didn't think I did denial. I had a lot of anger, but I find that it hits me, my sadness over what she went through. And the fact that up until the very end, she did not know me up until the second she died. That bothers me at times. And I find I don't want to watch any movies about Alzheimer's. I even have problems with commercials sometimes. But there was when I was going through my radiation, it was a little challenging because they had to. I had lymphoma in my eye, and so they would bolt my head to the table and and radiate me, and I don't do real good with that kind of stuff. And I remember one day I just started crying, and I wanted my mother. So here I am, 58 years old, in the cancer center, and I wanted my mom. You know, I think some griefs are very complicated. In fact, I had a nurse once say to me, "You have a very complicated grief because, being a caregiver, issues from your childhood, issues with family, and now health problems. That I don't think it really ran a normal path. Now, there are stages in Alzheimer's, but what I found with my mother, the one thing I do want to tell people is with stages of Alzheimer's, you can't look at what's going to happen in stage 1 through 7 and think that your loved one is going to neatly go from stage to stage to stage. When my mother died, she was exhibiting signs of every single stage. They don't go from stage to stage neatly.
Interesting. Would you consider loneliness and guilt stages?
I didn't have any loneliness stages, but I did have guilt stages for the times that I was maybe sharp with her. There were times I never really lost my temper with her, but sometimes I'd be a little snarky because I'd be tired, or she's telling the same story for the 75th time and I'm ready to lose my mind. It's hard.
When did you write the book?
I wrote the book. I finished the book in 2013, 3 years after she died.
Okay. And it published when?
It came out early 2014, January.
Okay. So you're kind of reinvigorating it, going on a book tour. That's your desire?
I'm hoping to. My husband and I are RVers, and we're hoping, if all goes well with him, we're hitting the road in April, and nobody's going to see us around here until November or December.
And you said the book has kind of had a resurrection of sales recently, yes?
Yes, it has. I had spent when my husband first started getting sick, we were busy with doctor's appointments, so I kind of backed off a little bit. But now I'm getting out there more, speaking with more people, so I'm getting a lot more interest. I also volunteer at Lisa's Care Connection in Columbia, and more people there. I donated books for their library, and more people are reading my book a little further away from Aiken, South Carolina.
Right. Well, that's pretty good. Is there anything that you want to add before we wrap it up?
I'm going to reiterate what you say, and that is you have to take care of yourself. I literally did not take care of myself. I had 7 hospitalizations before I had surgery because I would not get I wouldn't get surgery while my mother was still alive, because even though she didn't know me, she didn't see me. If she didn't see me, she became horribly agitated, and I didn't want her transferred back to a mental health facility. So instead of doing what I should have done, which was get surgery immediately, I put that off for 2 years.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
what kind of things could you have done differently? Now I don't know if cancer is preventable. They say diet and exercise and what you eat. But if you had to do it all over again, what would you have changed about your health or your diet or exercise to maybe avoid some of the complications that you experienced?
I wouldn't have had a venti frappuccino every single day for breakfast. Literally, I would get up in the morning, get ready, get her ready, do all my thing, and then I would just stop at a coffee shop and get some great big sweet, very bad for you, highly caloric drink, and that would be my breakfast. And then all I would eat during the day would be peanut butter. I
And what
mean,
about
it was
exercise?
awful.
Did you get any exercise?
Very little.
Yeah.
Very little. I
Oh,
would forget to take my vitamins. I wasn't sleeping well. And I did every single thing probably you weren't supposed to do,
yeah.
except
So
smoke.
like the
I
guy
would never,
says, like the old man says, he says, you can pay me now, but you can pay me later, but you're going to pay me.
which
So
I
you
paid
can,
later with interest.
you can, with interest. Good
With
point.
interest.
You caregivers out there, you're not cheating anybody but yourself. You're just postponing the inevitable. It's like debt. It just piles up, piles up, piles up. And one day there will be a day of reckoning. And sometimes that reckoning is going to have to be a bankruptcy or death from stress. You have got to take care of yourself.
And
What
let
would
me
you
say this to,
go
I'm going
ahead?
to say, sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. I want to say this to the caregivers. I am not a little petite, delicate creature. I take after my grandmother Lula. I am a big,
Calamity Jane.
strong, I'm a big, strong woman with very good health and a lot of stamina and a lot of ability to just keep going and keep going and keep going. But you know what? You can't keep going as a caregiver. It's bigger than you. It's
You're not the
meaner
ever
than you.
ready bunny.
Yeah, it's stronger than you, and it'll take you down.
So, did I ask you what you wanted to be remembered for?
I want to. I want to be remembered for being very friendly to people, liking people, and caring for people, and making a lot of people laugh.
Well, you look very healthy, so you obviously must have come through your operations and your cancer well, and you look very, very healthy.
I did. Yes, yes. I'm on the upswing.
So, congratulations to that. And with that, I want to thank you for coming on with such short notice, and thank you for such a great interview. And if anyone wants to get a hold of you or talk to you or buy your book, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Best way to get a hold of me is to find me on Facebook. I have 2 pages. I have my personal page and I have my book page. And my book page has a picture of my book. So you just go to Sandra
Great.
Savell, Savell, and you will find me and I will get right back to you.
Well, thanks again, and thank you everybody for coming on. We're here every week, Wednesday at noon, so we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you for joining Dave, the Caregiver's Caregiver Radio Show. Make sure you tune in every Wednesday at noon Pacific Time and anytime afterwards on podcast to catch more of Dave and his tips to caregivers on avoiding burnout and surviving the grief process right here on the Worldwide Block Talk Radio Network. Goodbye.